gold was physically constrained.
Yes. Right. And
So
that's
physical
why it was
constraints.
ultimately politically accepted.
Okay. And so what happened when we switched off gold? We removed the physical constraints.
Well, yes. The people in charge of the abstract imaginal power hierarchy wanted to throw off the shackles of proof of work gold in the same way that Vitalik is trying to throw off the yoke of proof of work now.
Yeah.
So to try and bring this somewhat full circle, perhaps, post-merge Ethereum proof of stake is an imaginal structure that's irreconcilable to reality now, right? It doesn't have proof of work. There's no way to reconcile it to reality. So if it can't reconcile to reality, then inevitably it's going to diverge. And so this is the rise of the God King, right? The Vitalik God King trying to be in charge of his little imaginary hierarchy. But with the emergence of this irreconcilable hierarchy come massive incentives to defect, because people are being sucked into this thing, or they're joining this thing voluntarily, whatever, but they're being exploited, right? You're being exploited. If you're in proof of stake and you're not one of the early miners or founders or pre-miners or whatever, if you're not on top of the heap, you're basically being exploited over time, right? That's what proof of stake does. It's centralizing power and wealth in the system. So those that are being, let's say, dispossessed in that hierarchy, right? They're not getting the power and wealth. They're not benefiting from the proof of stake system. The incentives for them to defect are growing, which is to say, this is the essence of game theory. I want to minimize my losses and I want to be unexploitable. Well, if I'm participating in this POS system, well, I'm getting exploited and my losses are stacking up. So with the accretion of those two things come my incentive to defect. And so does that mean that that's the ultimate, if we have to speculate about the demise of proof of stake, does it just fork itself to death? Like all these people try to defect and start their own little God King hierarchy and it just dissolves? Or like, where do you, I think you've made a pretty strong case that proof of stake doesn't work, and we've beaten it up a lot over a lot of episodes. There's also the Bible verse that I read at one point that kind of sums it up. So like proof of stake in our own little abstract virtual reality here, it's not going to work in the real world. How do you think it fails?
When you take wild animals and you remove their capacity to cause severe physically prohibitive costs on their attackers, they become docile, they become weak, they become extremely easy to exploit, they become lambs to the slaughter, they worship their masters, and it turns out ugly. So we know for sure that when you remove a population's capacity to be physically aggressive, aka to impose severe physical prohibitive costs in watts, they become systemically vulnerable. Repeat that for agrarian society. When when people use their rhetoric to convince people to forfeit their physical aggression, to forfeit their capacity to impose severe physical costs on attackers using watts, they become systemically exploited, they become oppressed. That oppression reaches a state of severity that people become willing to accept the energy expenditure and the risk of injury to reset the control authority. And that's what a war is.
Or a revolution even.
Or so a revolutionary war. So so the end state for the last at least 7,500 years of every time people have used rhetoric to try to replace the systemic security features of physical power using an abstract form of power, it backfires. It leads directly to war. It leads directly to energy expenditure and injury at scales which never existed before the emergence of abstract power hierarchies and morally superior alternatives. So regardless of whether you decide to formally codify that abstract power hierarchy and that control structure through laws, through parchment, or through Python, or through some program, The end state is war. Well, I guess I should say the end state is exploitation and abuse and oppression at such massive scale that people eventually learn to accept physical power as, and so the end state of proof of stake is Bitcoin, right? Eventually, people are going to achieve a state of systemic oppression, of systemic exploitation and abuse that they are going to concede. And they're going to admit that there is no replacement for physical power. There never has been a replacement for physical power. There never will be a replacement for physical power in terms of its ability to achieve the complex emergent behavior of proper systemic security. So it will break, it won't break, it'll behave exactly as it's designed to behave, as we have 5,000 years of written testimony to say it behaves. And then they'll just figure it out. But it's like, just buy Bitcoin now. Like the amount of suffering that is going to happen if the world, if our, like before, it actually brought me to tears because of how sad it makes me. We have an opportunity here to fix this. You just have to acknowledge there is no replacement for physical power, and you have to stop being so sanctimonious and self-righteous and using rhetoric and ideologies to justify not using physical power when it's very clear that there is no replacement for it for achieving security. If you want to be secure, increase your capacity to impose severe physical costs in watts on other people who would try to deny your access to your property or who would try to exploit your policy. And by the way, it doesn't have to be kinetic. It doesn't have to be lethal. We can do this non-lethally. We can do this peacefully. We can do this in a way that's actually supportive of infrastructure, that actually develops infrastructure. You just have to get off your sanctimony. Stop villainizing, stop condemning physical power, because it always backfires. You're just shooting yourself in the foot. You're a fool if you believe that there is a way to achieve the same level of systemic security as Watts. So when Vitalik and all these other new God kings start to try to convince people that there is a way, that it's morally reprehensible to spend Watts to defend yourself, we read history. It's all there. We know exactly how it's going to play out. You either go to hard war, where you settle this asymmetry and abuse through kinetic power projection, or we go to soft war, where we do it through Bitcoin. And I have a feeling that nations and people are going to overwhelmingly desire the soft form of physical power. And so the end state of, like I said before, the end state of everything, it's not just like Ethereum. The end state of the act of people using abstract power to determine the legitimate state and chain of custody and establish control authority and all that and settle disputes is Bitcoin. So like this will transform the way nation states, operate, especially like through economic means, through financial means, but it's not just going to be limited to financial.